All right, speaking of international relations, Israel joining some 41 other nations at the UN Human Rights Council on Tuesday in backing Canada, or a Canadian resolution on China. Canada's statements putting pressure on China to end its brutal campaign against Uyghur Muslims and other minorities.
Credible reports indicate that over 1 million people have been arbitrarily detained in Xinjiang and that there's widespread surveillance disproportionately targeting Uyghurs and members of other minorities and restrictions on fundamental freedoms in Uyghur culture. There are also reports of torture or cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment or punishment, forced sterilization, sexual and gender-based violence, and forced separation of children from their parents by authorities.
Ambassador Norton then calling for China to immediately adopt UN recommendations for ending discrimination and detention of Chinese minorities, and to allow immediate, meaningful, and unfettered access to Xinjiang for both independent and UN observers. Israel's involvement in the action, however, while noble, is also very rare. Jerusalem typically trying not to antagonize major trading partners like China, but apparently bowing this time to pressures from the United States' Biden administration. Joining me now to expand on this deviation from the norms, Professor Mark Meirowitz, political analyst, American foreign policy expert, and professor at SUNY's Maritime College. Professor, thanks so much for being with us. Now, first off, just before Canada's statement, China ironically blasted Canada and called for an investigation into the recently discovered deaths of indigenous children in British Columbia in the late 1800s. And China's statement is backed by Russia, Belarus, Iran, North Korea, Syria, and Venezuela. Do you think that this is just China diverting attention, or is this representative of the alleged dysfunction at the UNHRC?
Well, first of all, Canada and China have had very difficult relations because Canada detained a Huawei executive on an extradition warrant from the United States. And in retaliation, China arrested two Canadians. They call them the two Michaels, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig, and been holding them without charges. So Canada and China are not in a good situation. About the UNHCR, I think it's pretty ironic that the UNHCR and the UN, which has constantly criticized Israel, opening up investigations on Israel, now makes a statement, an investigation in connection with China. So I think at this point, it's also a little bit ludicrous for Canada to be criticized for its indigenous treatment of indigenous people. It's very reminiscent of Putin when he lashes out at the United States for its history of racial injustice. I mean, it's hilarious. If you do something wrong, you point the finger at someone else and tell them they did something wrong, and that makes what you did right. I think my grandson is 5 years old. I think he learned this in school, that isn't true. You don't do that. You defend what you do, and if you're wrong, you're wrong.
All right, so will anything actually come of Canada's statement? Because, what sanctions or punitive actions can be passed that might sufficiently pressure China to change?
Pressuring China to change is an insurmountable and literally impossible function in the United Nations. Remember, the United Nations has a veto system, and China has a veto. It's one of what is called the permanent members of the Security Council. So taking action against China is not in the cards. But I think that this effort on the part of the Western nations and other nations like Canada and Israel and others to point attention to what China has been doing, not just in Xinjiang, but also Hong Kong was mentioned and Tibet was mentioned, I believe, in the UN. This is important because autocratic regimes like China cannot withstand criticism. We've seen that also with Russia. So again, maybe this will be helpful. As far as sanctions, I don't see those as being effective right now in dealing with China.
All right, now let's talk a little bit about Israel then. Israel has until now walked this tightrope when it came to issues between the United States and China, usually opting to just stay silent. What effect, if any, do you predict will come of this change in policy? Will trade with China suffer? Will China somehow punish Israel and other Canadian backers, or was it really just not that notable?
Look, Israel is taking the side of the Western nations, the United States and Canada. Keep in mind that China has a deal on the Belt and Road Initiative with Israel to build the Haifa port. Recently, actually, with U.S. pressure, Israel rejected a Chinese bid to build a desalination plant. So it's not just trade here that's at stake. It's also all of these interactions with China that are very important to Israel. So I think, yes, it possibly have an effect. We've seen that China is very, very sensitive. Looking at Australia, for example, when Australia raised the issue of the coronavirus, China hammered them with tariffs and embargoes. So I'm not sure where this is going to go. Again, the publicity has not been focusing on Israel, it's been focusing on Canada. So maybe Israel can be a minor party in this and side with the Western powers and maybe go forward with its relationship with China unaffected, but we don't know.
All right, Professor Mark Meirowitz, thank you so much.
Thank you.